basically we've evolved over millions of years to eat unrefined food, basically to be the processors, our guts and our chewing, because that's where digestion starts, to be the processors of our food. And because we've never evolved to deal with as much refined carbohydrate, i.e. carbohydrate that's been processed, broken down, pre-digested by a machine to make white bread, pasta, whatever, we were never designed to deal with all of that.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. Do please help me out in my passion for these subjects by sharing the shows with other people like yourselves who will find it interesting. It is a huge help and I'm so grateful for all your feedback, guys. It's been an absolute journey the last couple of years. I'm so chuffed this is getting out to so many people. So today, we're going to be learning everything we need about how food relates to our mood and our state of mind. We're going to be laying out the fundamentals of how different groups of food and qualities of food influence directly our mental and physical health, how the gut species depletion and the increase in inflammation are key consequences of the changes we're seeing in the Western industrial diet, and how we can counter that with some really quite simple tricks. Now, fortunately, the vast biological, nutritional, and medical knowledge required to understand this quite complex relationship between diet and health is beautifully explained in the work of our guest today, herbal medicine clinician Alex Laird. Alex is a medical herbalist with more than 20 years clinical experience. She trained in biomedicine and plant pharmacology. She treats patients in the only NHS herbal clinic based in the UK hospital at Whipps Cross. She's a fellow and council member of the College of Practitioners of Phytotherapy, the CPP, for anyone who wants to go and check out that organisation. She worked with Breast Cancer Haven UK for over 20 years using nutritional therapies for cancer. Alex has undertaken clinical research. She's a visiting lecturer and she's published numerous research papers. And she's the co-founder of the charity Living Medicine. Now, she is also the author of a new book, Root to Stem, which is out on Penguin, which talks about seasonal foods and remedies for strong health and immunity that can be found literally growing in the hedgerow around your house. So having personally had a bad run-in with an intestinal dysbiosis after getting parasites in the water in India, which led to all kinds of mental symptoms like irritability, exhaustion, brain fog, allergies, intolerance, and IBS. Food was a huge part of the solution that I found. So I really wanted to share these key understandings, as I think that this applies to all of Western diet, not just for those like me that had an extreme case that brought it to my attention. So I think this can be really helpful for all of us. So without further ado, let's go. Alex Laird, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thank you so much for joining me. And what a joy to have a family friend on the show at last.
Well, it's a great joy to be here, friends.
I'm really excited to have such a broad specialist on the show. But before we get there, Alex, I love to start by asking my guests about what first aroused their big questions in life when they were young. Now, I know you had a completely different career in TV before following your passion and becoming a medical herbalist. Were there any hints in your first pressing questions as an adolescent that, who knows, might have given some sense of where you'd end up?
Well, funny you should ask that, Fred. It's actually a very leading question because it's something that I thought about myself. And yes, I think there is. There was one moment, these great epiphanies we have, many of us have in life. And I can't remember what age I was, but I was standing on the loch side of Loch Lomond in Scotland. And it was the most stunning day. And I was very fortunate to have been brought up with parents that loved nature, sailed, fished, loved nature and being outdoors. And I remember being absolutely blown away by the stillness, the beauty, the colors of nature around me. The loch, the gorgeous sort of a dark orangey bracken against the pale blue sky. I think it was an autumn morning. And the perfection and the beauty and the variety, although I didn't really think about it at that time, was something that deeply struck me. And I thought, why do I feel so strongly? Why am I responding so strongly to this? And what do I need to do with this knowledge, even though it was sense and knowledge of beauty, if you like, nature's beauty? It wasn't what Gerald Durrell would have been doing, looking at little tiny beetles and looking at the detail and looking at the botany and every single flower and thinking, why are you like you are? It was the totality of the experience. And then, many years later, 40 or so years later, I come round to studying plants and plant medicine and foods and basically life. Like, that's what I feel I'm making sense of, is making sense of this extraordinary world we live in, and humans, and the strange Homo sapiens, not very sapiens, that we are. So yeah, that's where it started, I think.
And those kind of experiences in nature, they really give us a sense of how interdependent all of this incredible diversity is. And that's really something that we're going to be talking about today. So before we get on to your recent book, Root to Stem, I want to first set the scene for myself and for the listeners with a sort of background knowledge of why our diet is so fundamental to our psychological mood. Now, and a little aside for the listeners here, we're going to have a whole show on the fascinating new field of nutritional psychiatry, which is now studying the change in neurological and mental health metrics following different diets, with brilliant results coming from Professor Felice Jacka at Deakin University in Australia, exactly showing where we're going wrong in the West. So look out for that show. Again, we're also going to have a devoted show on the science of the immense community of microbes in the gut, known as the gut microbiome. It's now widely accepted to have a huge effect on our physiology and on our mood, and to play a central role in some of the inflammatory and autoimmune diseases that are universally on the rise, particularly in Western populations. The Sonnenberg lab at Stanford Medical School is doing really good work on this. For anyone who wants to go and have a quick look before that show comes out. Also, thanks to the Human Microbiome Project, which is slowly sequencing the genome of all the thousands of gut microbiome species. You can imagine how long that's going to take them. So on this show, it is definitely going to be central to understand this symbiotic role between the microbiome and the body and the mind. So look out for those shows, listeners. But despite those being separate shows, we're inevitably going to be touching them on them today, aren't we, Alex? Because they're just so relevant to this question of mood food. So Alex, start with this simple explanation of slow and fast absorption of sugars from our food to just begin tentatively to unfold this complex picture of what foods we need to get the moods we need to thrive.
Well, first of all, certainly my approach is one that very much is evolutionary. As much information as we have, which of course we don't have always a lot of information about how humans and other mammals have evolved. But what we do know is that our diets 2 million or even before that, years ago, right up until probably around 12,000 years ago when we started growing our own food, or maybe we'd done that a bit before, but basically we've evolved over millions of years to eat unrefined food, basically to be the processors, our guts and our chewing, because that's where digestion starts, to be the processors of our food. And that it was it was food that was extremely rich in diversity itself. The actual plants that we were having, we had a very wide diet. We may have been absolutely been eating meat and fish. The fish probably contributed to our large brain. That's high protein foods. But in terms of sugars and carbohydrate, sugar is basically a carbohydrate. the way it came in whole plants, whole wild plants, for millions of years, to which our gut evolved, was in a whole form with lots of fiber, lots of phytochemicals, lots of other elements in the food, which our bodies then broke down itself. That's slow releasing. So every time you eat, let's say, even if it's as simple as a modern kiwi fruit here, if you just have the juice is basically part of sugar, is mostly sugar, with some pigments and phytochemicals in it, all very useful, but the juice is very sugary, and so that quickly raises our blood sugar because there's no processing to be done. It's absorbed very fast into the bloodstream. Whereas if you eat, let's say, this kiwi fruit with its fibrous coating, it's going to slow down that absorption of the sugars that are in that plant, in that fruit. So that means that the blood sugar is raised much more slowly. And because we've never evolved to deal with as much refined carbohydrate, i.e. carbohydrate that's been processed, broken down, pre-digested by a machine to make white bread, pasta, whatever, we simply were never designed to deal with all of that.
What does that mean for our mood, Alex? Does that mean does that mean that we're getting peaks of energy, which is presumably not that bad, but the problem is that afterwards there's a big drop? Is that what the problem is?
It doesn't matter short term, Fred. It's the long term. If it's chronic exposure, as it were, long term constant eating of refined carbohydrates, which raise our blood sugar very, very fast because there's not much processing to be done. It takes no time because all that's been done before to liberate those sugars. That raises our blood glucose very fast. Now and again, that's not a problem. But over time, if that becomes our permanent diet, if you like, pasta, white rice, bread, we're basically causing inflammatory responses in the body. And there are many, many mechanisms for that. It's just found, we've now discovered that it changes all kinds of cognitive changes, the hippocampus, which is part of our limbic system, which is in the prefrontal cortex up here, that can shrink over time. It can lead to depression, other cognitive problems, emotional problems, because of various different mechanisms, inflammatory responses, lack of nutrients, high, what are called, glucocorticoids, high cortisol, and other. Over time, short amounts of these are what we're designed for, but not long term. And that's when the pathologies, the diseases, the chronic problems start to happen.
Well, that is exactly what we're about to come back and talk about. Okay, so that's the carb side of things. And the key here is slow burn, slow release. But where does protein come into this? Because is there anything to these dietary suggestions that are becoming very popular now where protein plays a much larger role and the quantity of carbs is reduced? In some of these, in the GAPS diet, even vegetables are being removed. What changes when we lower the carb levels back to some of the kind of percentages some of our ancestors might have eaten? Is that a solution that's seeing positive results in terms of the pathologies you just spoke about? Tell us about some high protein diets.
Well, there are various groups of people who are still eating quite high protein diets, like Inuit, Eskimos who are having a lot of fish. You could say also the Maasai who are eating, or were eating, a lot of blood, which is high protein, and meat, and so on, and milk. But it seems like it's these protein diets are actually not necessarily harmful when people have adapted to them. It looks as though human beings adapt genetically and epigenetically. Environment, geography, especially over the long term, is very important in how our genes actually function and how we process food. So more protein doesn't seem to be a problem, except it can be if we aren't ready to deal with that. So high protein diets can lead to extra, you were going to come to this anyway, acidosis, metabolic acidosis, which means that there's more, because protein is basically made of amino acids, lots of different amino acids in various forms, and meat, fish, and so on. Our muscle is made of, basically, we are meat, we are made of meat, a lot of protein, a lot of amino acids, very important. So when you break that protein down, what your body has to do, it basically breaks down to acids, which the body then has to buffer. Now, in small-ish amounts, it doesn't matter. The body is literally may have to, but long-term and high-protein diets may have to take, and often does, especially if there are other things going on, like high carbs as well, but is to remove the buffers, which is bicarbonate, from, or calcium carbonate, if you like, from bone. So long-term, high acid or protein or high acid forming diets can lead to this increased need for buffering, because you can't excrete acid. That would be painful in the urine, for example, or in the feces. It would be very painful to have a very acid excretory waste matter from the body. So the body has to buffer that, i.e. make it more alkaline, by adding in things like carbonate and so on, so that it's comfortable to excrete, both from the kidney and from the gut.
So that might deplete the bones over time.
Certainly over time, it can lead to osteoporosis, osteopenia, cardiovascular problems. We need to have calcium. We need basically minerals like calcium, magnesium, sodium, in particular, to be in the right levels for our muscle to function, our heart, which is a muscle, to function, for every cell that has literally what's called a sodium-potassium pump. And that sodium-potassium pump is very reliant, fairly reliant on how we eat. And a very acid-forming diet, i.e. very protein-rich, or other compounds that make acidity that then has to be neutralized in the body, it's sometimes, if you're really exposing yourself chronically to eating that way, your body eventually has to break down, it uses up a lot of these buffering chemicals. And
well, that's definitely something we need to bear in mind for anybody out there, listeners, who's thinking about ketogenic or high protein approaches. It's something to bear in mind. But on the positive side, Alex, I've heard that paleo approaches, this is often called the paleo approach because it's like the Paleolithic man's kind of diet, that these paleo approaches lead to increased focus and less mood swings, so less of the sort of up and down that we're seeing with the glycemic index.
Glycemic index,
Alex? The glycemic index, thank you. Yeah. Is it worth offsetting these mineral questions you've just raised? Is it worth it for the increased focus and the sort of less mood swings that we see when we move towards a slightly higher proportion of protein versus carb?
I think, frankly, Fred, you can't, if you're going to be eating more protein, that may be fine. The key thing is all the other things that you need to be eating in a balanced diet. This is the fundamental thing. So the key thing is not just how much protein. It's also about making sure that the rest of the body is fully nourished and has enough of those buffering elements that you're going to find in vegetables. So all the evidence is pointing so far to eating more plants. That is the bottom line, because yes, there are lots of vitamins and minerals in protein-based foods, especially if they're 100% grass-fed or mostly grass-fed animals, and fish that have not been fish farmed, and again have been exposed to and ingesting a wide diet themselves from the sea. So the whole point, Fred, is that it's all about variety. This is it, a little of a lot. So that we're getting, I think it's worth making one thing very clear. you're talking, when you talk about protein, fats, and carbs, we're talking about macronutrients, the big things that basically contribute to the structure of our body, the bones, the body itself. The micronutrients are those called the vitamins and minerals, which there's been lots of research about. We know a lot about those. What has been left out until more recently is the phytonutrients, the phytochemicals. Plant is phyto is plant in Greek. I'm a phytotherapist. That's the European term for a medical herbalist. So what we are realizing now, well, we knew it before, but what is being recognized now is the absolute essential requirement, not for the energy, but for the functioning, the full functioning of the body. That is the circulation, the liver function, literally keeping the blood vessels elastic, immune responses, of course, gut microbiome as well, all the microbiome. It's not just in the gut, it's on the skin, it's on any living thing. Basically, there's colonization by microbes, viruses, and fungi.
So this is something we're going to be coming back to in detail in a moment, Alex. So if you don't mind, we'll come back to that, because I definitely want to understand that in more detail. But I just want to continue laying the foundation for now. Now, you've already mentioned this, and it's not a surprise that it's such a red flag that's being flown at the moment. All the processed foods in our industrial Western diets. Now, I've always wanted to understand this connection between food and inflammation. I don't even know why inflammation is bad for us. So tell us, what are the knock-on effects of our industrialized diets here, both in the gut, but particularly for this systemic inflammation question?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's still being unraveled, some of the mechanisms that are connecting high refined carbohydrate intake and inflammation. The body has many kinds of inflammation. First of all, what we do know is that too much glucose or refined carbs literally promotes the pathogenic functions of some cells of the immune system. So things like what's called Th17, which are inflammatory cells. They're T helper cells. They're types of white blood cell in the body that are raised, for example, in COVID or other inflammatory conditions or viral any kind of infection. So those are ramped up. Basically, inflammatory cells are literally ramped up, are increased by excessive chronic consumption of carbohydrate, refined carbohydrate.
But that's an immune response. That's a response of the body actually protecting itself. So why is it so bad for you?
Because we were never designed for it. It's a toxin, really. Sugar is a toxin. And maybe as hunter-gatherers, and I'm not that keen on any of the word called diets like Paleolithic or any of these things, because they tend to narrow the field. They can be really helpful. They can be really helpful to, as they say, dig down and explore information, but they can also be too narrow. And as we're now discovering. But with inflammation, there are various things. Basically, when you eat a lot of high blood sugar, you get a lot of high blood sugar from eating refined carbohydrates. Your blood sugar goes up. Insulin then is released in order to take that sugar, that glucose, and put it into storage if it's not being used. So that can go into fat cells. So one of the mechanisms of that high insulin is, first of all, high insulin over a long period is inflammatory. As you know, it leads to diabetes as well. Also fat, which is the storage of triglycerides, it's storage of sugar, is also inflammatory. We now know that fat acts like a hormone. And our hormones are all about growth factors. It's a growth factor, in effect. So fat, over a long period, that is, when it's not being used because we're not in periods of starvation, that is basically becoming an inflammatory hormone. So many conditions, and we know now that all disease, whether it's eczema to cardiovascular disease, is basically involving various kinds of inflammation.
And presumably there's a side of this that's not only about the carbs being more refined, but there's also a question about the industrialized process of making those foods, right? So there's a lot of the minerals and vitamins you've just been talking about removed in that industrial process, which again is just taking things more out of balance. Is there an element in that in terms of the industrial process with which it's being made?
Well, I mean, industrial processing is digestion. It's pre-digested food. You couldn't even call it baby food because you don't really want to feed a baby unwhole food once it's weaned. It needs whole food. And that means the fiber. And here's another thing, Fred, the fiber. I mean, just going back, whether this was a grain or a fruit, the seed, the seed and the skin
the husk
are the sources where the plant concentrates its phytochemicals and, to some extent, its minerals and its vitamins. So if you're taking a refined carbohydrate plant, I mean, it's got protein, of course, 10%, well, about 10%, maybe less, maybe more, say wheat. If you take away the coating, the roughage, you're taking away the fiber, you're taking away most of the minerals, the vitamins, and also the phytochemicals, because the phytochemicals, which are so important for immunity, for circulation, for liver, and numerous functions in the body, are actually in that coating. They're the colors and the tastes, and you're left by industrial processing with just the refined, some of the protein, yes, and the sugars and some fats in a grain, for example.
Well, and this segues nicely into the importance of pH, which you mentioned earlier, that, maybe if we're pushing, because we're eating a lot more fish and meat than we used to, if we're pushing that level, and if we're including many less of these phytonutrients, we have an issue with pH, you mentioned, where we see this acidification. Now, this is a crucial background to where we're going to go to talk about the gut. Tell us, what does the kind of Western diet we're discussing lead to in terms of a change in pH over time? And what are the problems associated with acidity? And what recommendations do you have, Alex? Because all of your brilliant talks and texts and workshops, they always talk about the solutions. Tell us about this pH issue and what we can do straight away to offset it.
Well, in a nutshell, it's about having more alkaline forming foods, and those are plants. I mean, it really is simple. In terms of solutions, it's really about widening our diet to more plant-based foods. One thing that's actually very important that we haven't touched on in meat and other protein-rich foods is we are eating what it ate or how it was grown. So if an animal, when you say that we're eating a lot more meat, that probably is true because it has been until now more available. But the meat itself, the poor cow, is not necessarily, or whatever animal it is, isn't necessarily eating the natural diet, which, like us, should be a very wide, 100, 200 plants in a pasture, which ditto chickens and their eggs. Basically we're feeding chickens corn, we're feeding all kinds of foods to animals for meat, cows, to put weight on quickly. It's all about the bottom line, the profit. Now, the trouble is they're eating the wrong foods that don't, therefore, within that protein food, bring all those fantastic phytochemicals, the healthy fats, the omega-3s, the anti-inflammatory omega-3s should be higher in meat if it's fed on if it's fed in pasture, not just grass, but a rich pasture. It's not just protein on its own, the meat, but all the other elements that come in there to help us metabolize it correctly and not put a load of extra acid or other load on our bodies.
Why does that lead to acidity in the gut? And why is acidity a problem? What does this shift towards an acid pH lead to?
Again, there are different ways in which an acid, what would be called, the potential renal acid load, basically, once you break down, your digestion breaks down your protein into all sorts of elements, including amino acids and acids of various kinds, which, as I say, need to be buffered by, i.e. neutralized, by alkaline elements like bicarbonate. That's the main form, because otherwise the blood will become too acid. Now, the blood actually is very, very good at making sure that it keeps, or the body is very good, careful at making sure that the blood pH is around 7.5. That's a very key thing. So in order to maintain that neutralish area, neutralish pH, we need to be taking in all those foods that help to contain that. So that means alkaline based, that once you break them down, they become more, the residue is more alkaline. And that's where plants do that. If you have too much acidity, your body is constantly trying to process or buffer, neutralize, from proteins and other acid-forming foods, you're going to be drawing calcium and calcium carbonate out of the bone over long term, not immediately, but over the long term, which can lead to osteoporosis. Cancer cells form more easily in an acid environment. If you think about it, our environment, whether it's an environment, i.e. epigenetics coating the gene, around the gene, the environment that the gene is living in or operating in, the environment that we operate in, whether it's emotional or physical, geographical, temperature, pollution. Environment is exactly what determine the response. That's what our bodies are designed for. So back to the acidosis or acid. Tumors proliferate in a more acid environment. Apart from that, it's called the renal acid-base balance, the potential renal acid load. So your kidneys have to do a lot. They're the major organ responsible for moderating and controlling that acid alkaline base. And so they are the ones that are making sure that they're filtering. They may have to filter out a lot of acid, and that's when you get a very acidic urine and you've been taking too much. Basically, what that leads to is this lack of very important minerals in our body. And yes, does lead to inflammation, because dietary acid load actually stimulates these glucocorticoids like cortisol, and cortisol also increases acid excretion. But long term, this high acid load is actually inflammatory, leads to hypertension, changes in the limbic areas, changes in the brain, and emotional and mental responses.
Fascinating, isn't it, how responsive and adaptable the human body is? But there's a cost, people, and we've got to understand how to offset that, at least in the midterm and long term, even if we don't have absolute control in the short term. And that brings us beautifully to the microbiome itself. Now, as I said, we're going to be doing a whole show on the enteric nervous system, which is the name for the really complex nervous system of the gut. But suffice to say for now that the intimate connection between this very, very complex enteric system and the vagus nerve, with its emotional self-regulation and its social co-regulation function, among many other things that the vagus nerve does, it means that the gut, the state of the gut, is central to our everyday state of mind. So we'll just leave it at that for now. But today I wanted to touch more on this vast array of species living inside the gut. The theme of this series is symbiosis, and I really think this is an extraordinary example of that, although they're littered throughout nature. Give us a little overview, Alex, of this symbiotic relationship between the thousands of species living in the gut and our body itself, ourselves, the host.
Well, living in our gut and the body, I'm glad you mentioned the body, because on the skin, for example.
They're everywhere, aren't they?
Everywhere, in the scalp, on the skin. They're even on the computers that there are biofilms, and there are microbes, which are viruses, bacteria, and fungi, living on the biofilm. So there's a lot of activity on our skin, which is our most outer defense layer, you could say. The microbes that are colonizing that, symbionts, we might call them, are, or commensals, there are lots of different words, basically at this very minute, they are eating sugars, carbs, sugars and proteins and fats on our skin that's being shed, and they are helping to create the defense layer of acidity. So this is where acid is good. What microbes often do, bacteria in particular, is that they eat up and Lactobacillus acidophilus,
good word,
which is one of the most that's the most populous, one of the most popular species of bacteria in the gut, but also to some extent here, and as we know, also in fermented foods like yogurt. What those lacto milk bacilli, that's the name, bacillus is the name for the kind of rod-shaped bacteria. Acidophilus it's a milk sugar, as in this case, acid-loving bacteria. So it eats the milk sugar or sugars on here and secretes acid. Now that's a symbiotic for us because we need the right kinds of acid, not necessarily the protein, the damaging acids that we often get too much of from proteins. We get those healthy acids which contribute to a defensive pH layer on the skin within the waxy cuticle or a part of the waxy cuticle. In the gut, those same bacteria, and not just the lactobacillus and the bifido, which are producing these acids, but they're also, which are called also short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, propionic acid, which actually are giving the body energy. So short-chain fatty acids are absolutely essential to give energy to the gut. They're also helping to make white blood cells, to mature white blood cells, i.e. our immune cells, through what are called Peyer's patches, which are a very immune-rich. Many of our gut cells many of our immune cells, most of them are actually in the gut itself. Mm. And that's because we're going to be taking in a foreign, maybe possibly threatening or challenging substance into the body, as in food, which needs to be neutralized by very high hydrochloric acid or very low pH and hydrochloric acid in the gut, in the stomach, and then go through into the gut where it's challenging the immune system. So fiber, soluble fiber, all these things which we'll talk about in a minute, they basically help feed that incredible array, at least 400 species, maybe more, of the gut microbes, in order for those to literally perform a whole range, produce acids, beneficial acids, short-chain fatty acids, support white blood cells, and so on. So they're doing a huge array, and all their functions are now being elucidated. And it's not just it's the metabolites that they produce. You know, basically the you could say waste products that they produce, these bacteria, as they feed on our foods, that are actually very, very important in our functioning.
And you spoke about evolution. In that sense, basically, we have evolved completely alongside this community. Is that right? I mean, there's a real, shall we say, a sort of balance between their ability to help us and our ability to sustain them. Really, I think the thing that shocks me here is there's a philosophical question here. I think it's up to 5 kilos of microbes we've actually got in us. And the question is that us or isn't it? You know, because in a sense, there's a symbiotic relationship that it's not really part of the body. But let's face it, we need this. And so we get this new idea, this new image of us being utterly codependent with elements of our environment. And
that is the nature of life. That is what life is. So that right at the beginning of evolution, you know, after the so-called Big Bang, maybe it wasn't a Big Bang, but, you know, when eventually a cell developed and it found another cell, and eventually it led to complex organisms being developed because of, I'm one cell, you're another cell. I mean, this is really simplistic, but you know, you're another cell, you're slightly different from me, and you can do something that I can't do, and I can do something you can't do. So let's get together and one makes three. That's a very crude way of describing it. But we literally, plants do not evolve without an animal, an insect, a bird to allow them to, for example, spread their seed. There is a constant, this is the story of life itself, is that it's about reciprocity. It's give and take. Nothing exists in isolation.
And we're so conditioned.
And there's death, permanent death. And that's what we're moving towards, sadly, with our, human extinction of what's incredibly important to us. But we're too limited to see how important it is that we have, even though there may be some extinction going on all the time, but there is newness, and how precious these tiny little insects, or microbes for that matter, are. But now we're beginning to learn. The other key thing, Fred, is that this reciprocity in the gut, between us and our microbes who are doing all these important things and keeping us alive, it depends on a diversity of microbes. If you only eat a very narrow diet, you're not then encouraging the diversity of microbes. We are gardening all the time. We're basically trying to feed. Ideally, we're feeding a wide variety of foods to keep alive this healthy diversity in all senses, whether it's individuals, whether it's society, whether it's microbiome of whatever kind, thrives when there is diversity. When there is a reduction in diversity, that's usually when the more pathogenic bacteria, the ones that are disease, encourage disease, allow disease and inflammation to develop, actually become dominant. Like everybody understands things like thrush, candida, it's candida albicans is the mycobacteria. It's a kind of fungal bacterium, develop. And then sugar, for example, high sugar diets or highly refined diets and not enough diversity of fruit and veg, or veg and fruit, I should say, and fiber, help to keep that under control. So a really well-organized, diverse microbiome, which is not a static thing. It may be changing all the time as our environment changes, our food changes, but basically you need to have a minimal amount of diversity to keep the pathogenic bacteria in check.
Absolutely. And this is something we're going to come back to in a moment when we talk about what happens when it doesn't with the dysbiosis. But there's another point here, Alex, about the fact that we're so conditioned by this idea of competition through the theory of evolution that we don't understand it's not about a winner. Competition is about a series of things working in harmony. Yes, they're competing against each other, but that's what keeps this symbiotic harmony. I think we have such a strong sort of westernized idea of competition that we sort of think that there's a winner and that the rest as a result are useless, and actually it's not like that. We need very much the losers as well. We need this full spectrum in balance, keeping in check the positive and the negative. And I think that as this conversation develops, listeners, I'd like you just to have this strong image of all of these elements remaining constantly present and that includes viruses and bacteria, which is something we're going to come on to in a minute. So let's spend a moment, Alex, on a few of these crucial factors to the development of the microbiome in the first place when we're kids. The list, we could spend a whole episode just on this, so we're just going to touch on it. We've got the importance of vaginal birth as opposed to cesarean, passing through where the vaginal microbes are, and also the fecal microbes of the mother. Breastfeeding itself, obviously huge, and a whole conversation itself. The family pets, the presence of pets in the family home. Contact with the soil, which I'm sure you've got something to say on that, Alex, because that's a big part of your work. And obviously, we're just going to touch on it briefly, the frequency of the use of antibiotics. Is there anything to mention on these points, Alex? Feel free to just pick a few.
Well, certainly, as you say, Fred, exactly right. A baby born through the birth canal, through the vagina, is picking up, and it's the reason why the baby comes out, like that. It's picking up in its mouth for the first time, it's actually getting hold of both vaginal and, but maybe more importantly, gut fecal microbes from the mother. And because gut microbes live in the gut, vaginal microbes live in the vagina, different kinds of microbes, different environment again. This is the key. So yes, that is how it seems to be a beneficial thing for the baby to have those microbes to pick it up, because that is then going to trigger, challenge the gut to actually respond, to build its immune responses. So absolutely fundamental. If anything that touches a newborn, so if it's a cesarean baby, then the baby is likely to be getting on its skin the microbes of whoever's picking it up, from what we breathe and so on. Yes, it won't get so much until it starts feeding from the breast, as you say. And then it'll get a lot of microbes, hopefully, from that, but maybe not so decent from the formula feed, because formulas perhaps don't have that great array of microbes and phytochemicals that they should have, that would be naturally going into a mother's breast milk. So yes, soil as well, the baby crawling around on soil, around pets. I mean, they are literally picking up fecal microbes as well, from pets, whose bums are on the ground, and the baby is picking everything, even if not literally feces, it's picking up spores or...
So this is diversity and immune response.
It's basically challenge. Imagine this: if I am waiting, if I don't challenge my arm, I don't use my arm, my muscle, it'll wither. If I'm not challenging my body with food, with its microbes and maybe some pathogenic, disease, so-called disease causing. I don't really go for this germ theory. It's all a bit primitive. But threatening or challenging microbes, we simply would not be responding. You wouldn't be training the immune system. You wouldn't be using that muscle, because the body is so beautifully designed that it's not going to produce what it doesn't need to. It only produces in response to a load or a challenge. It's terribly important, because that's the principle, again, about life. It's a challenge. We'll come on to that, because I should just describe something about why phytochemicals are developed in a plant, because that's really key, what they are and why they're there. But basically, yes, we pick all of these things, these very important microbes, up through exposure to them. And so a really good person to explore is on the non-microbe in the gut, but all the other microbes in the air, such as they are, on surfaces and so on, is Graham Rook of UCL, Professor Graham Rook.
Okay, we'll
very interesting what he's doing.
Reference his work.
Yeah. Or even just Google his name, because he's got some very useful resources. UC Graham Rook, ROOK, and GRAHAM, Professor Graham Rook.
One of the big problems about dysbiosis, which we're about to have a quick chat about, is the frequent use of antibiotics. Now, the genius of penicillin goes without saying. It has completely revolutionized human life. But the question I have here is there, shall we say, perhaps not yet enough understanding of the consequence that has on the quantity of species, because presumably we're taking out some good species at the same time, and therefore there should be a much wider understanding of repopulating after the use of antibiotics?
Well, yes, because exactly. Antibiotics can be life-saving, but we basically overused them, and overused them in animals, which is, of course, is changing the way that the quality of the protein of the meat. So antibiotics, yes, they basically do change, and seem to be either long-term or short-term our gut microbes. At least our gut microbes, as well as lots of other things. They are also anti-inflammatory, so antibiotics are used in inflammatory conditions as well as conditions of infection. But just what each of us needs in terms of repopulating the gut microbiome after antibiotics, which actually can be helpful in an overgrowth of dominant species in hand with a diet. But exactly which microbes they're killing off in you as opposed to me is not really understood yet. But what we do know, I mean, basically, Fred, it comes back to the same old thing, which is, on the whole, is we should be eating a much, much more diverse whole food, i.e. unrefined diet. And that means spices, anyway, we'll come to that. But we don't yet know exactly which, if you were going to take, and if they're useful, if you are going to take probiotics, which ones, because they're going to be different in each of us. But it's a sort of suck it and see, it's trial and error. You have to try for yourself. What works for one person may not work for another.
It does bring us on to this slightly sticky topic of dysbiosis, because in my opinion, I mentioned in the introduction, Alex, the massive run-in that I had following that difficult parasite from India, which I did manage to presumably kill with antibiotics, but the antibiotics were so strong, and because I didn't repopulate, it led to a dysbiosis, which, as you know, because you helped me with this, led to a candida overgrowth, which is a very, very common symptom of Western high sugar diet and high stress diet, high stress life as well. So I just wanted to mention this thing of dysbiosis, which is the name for it, when this fine balance of species gets out of whack and the body can no longer keep it in check with those tricks you were talking about earlier. What warning signs might people notice if they sort of start to look out for it? And what would be the best way to rebalance that using food?
Well, the classic sign, I suppose, are fairly general. So it's not always easy to know what the cause is, but a viral, fatigue, redness under here, red, dark under the eyes, dark skin under the eyes, hyperpigmentation, that is, indigestion, possibly constipation, possibly, as you're saying, candida. That can be either, if it's in the gut, the overgrowth of candida in the gut, they change their shape to a more stringy form. There's candida that can really cause havoc in the gut lining, which is a filter, very important filter, very careful filter. So you just have a variety of, and also in the mouth you can have white patches of candida, like cottage cheesy kind of elements, or on the tongue, in the mucosa of the mouth, as well as vaginal, obviously not in a man, but you get vaginal thrush and possibly, well, you're not likely to get that in the urine, but possibly too much sugar in the urine, but that isn't likely to happen. But really, those generalized tiredness, poor liver function, poor gut function.
And long term, that could lead to systemic changes like autoimmune problems where the gut wall has been compromised. It can also lead
long term. That is
lead to allergies. I was getting allergies to stuff that I'd never had allergies before. There's a really strong autoimmune element here, isn't there?
There is a very, I mean, what that can lead to get gut dysbiosis basically causes inflammation. So you've got the wrong, as it were, the dominance of certain bacteria which are not healthy. That can also lead to inflammation in the gut wall, which means that the gut wall opens too much. You've got it's commonly called leaky gut, which allows the leakage of proteins and other complexes of foods to enter the bloodstream, which is on the other side of the gut wall, picking up all those nutrients. And that can set off problems. I mean, again, it's a very big range of pathogenic mechanisms that cause these things, whether it's allergy, even just intolerance, a challenge to the gut wall because of that imbalance of bacteria can actually cause all sorts of other inflammation and so on, or just gut problems themselves, indigestion, bloating, wind, and so on. But otherwise, if you're getting passage of proteins into the gut through the gut wall into the bloodstream over a long period, that's a major challenge on the body's immune system. It's not designed to deal with that. And that's what can indeed, over a long period, lead to autoimmune conditions, whether it's skin or colon, gut. When the gut, basically the body starts fighting itself. It recognizes a protein and it says, this is not a good thing. I'm going to attack it. So it could be skin, it could be the gut wall. There are a whole range of, it can attack almost any part of itself.
And so for any listeners who may have some symptomology that their doctors are finding elusive, this may be an interesting port of call to just to have a look at. For example, Crohn's disease, people have found extraordinary results just by simple things of including some fermented foods and just sorting out their gut microbiome. But we're going to be coming back to that, aren't we, Alex?
One of the things about dysbiosis, Fred, of course, is that it's particularly a loss of the most common microbes in the body, which are in the gut, which are firmicutes, things like Bacteroides strains, and lactobacillus and bifidus are among the most prominent. And just by including, as you've said, yogurt, especially live fermented yogurt or kefir, or kimchi, also kimchi too. But those you're putting back, they're basically mostly lactobacillus and bifidus. You're putting back lots of free, naturally occurring microbes outside the body, back into the body.
Now, Alex, this is a key point. Just before we take a break, we've mentioned it already. It seems to just come back at every stage about immunity. Now, the research, as we've mentioned already, seems to point to a very symbiotic relationship between bacteria being a fundamental part of our ability to live strongly in the presence of these pathogens. In fact, it's almost the pathogens themselves need to be present to stimulate that immunity. I'm also trying to get hold of the virologist, Professor Karen Merling, about her book, Viruses, More Friends Than Foe, to understand if our immunity and perhaps our genome itself have evolved so successfully specifically because they're constantly in the presence of these viruses. So both viruses and bacteria seem directly connected to the strength of our immunity. In fact, the deterioration of our Western gut microbiome species diversity seems to be directly proportional to the rise we're seeing in inflammatory, autoimmune, and metabolic conditions. From your point of view, Alex, is there a risk that our culture of antibiotics, of oversanification, of intense processing of foods, and progressively less contact with nature itself, will this lead to a collapse in our overall robust immunity?
Well, the obvious answer is yes. unless we moderate that and support our diversity in every sense. Yes, it will, because we're just not designed. That's not the way life is designed. So, oversanitation. I mean, you could argue it could be that over literally millions of years, if we manage to just tip the balance in favor of enough diversity, that our genes would respond to managing a lack of diversity. That is possible. But basically, that's not the way that the whole of life for 4.5 billion years, or 4 billion years at least, since it began, as we believe, has functioned. So it would require a major shift, I think, in the way life's processes work for our, you're saying does it lead to a collapse in the robustness of our immunity? I mean, absolutely. And in a short order, quickly, that happens quickly. Immunity starts with what we would call innate immunity. And innate immunity is good saliva, good hydrochloric acid, good, very low pH in the stomach to kill off pathogens, good skin microbiome as well, intact skin, more difficult in eczema, not so problematic in psoriasis. But, our immunity is our gut. It's all this innate immunity that actually supports us against. It's called innate immunity, the first most important immunity, as opposed to very specific kinds of adaptive immunity, which respond to particular viruses, for example, like coronavirus. But the first thing is making sure that robust immunity exists, robust innate immunity. And there are so many ways that we can boost that. Fewer antibiotics, less sanitation, except the wise washing of hands, because you don't particularly want to ingest too many of the wrong fecal microbes through the mouth as an adult. It's knowing what is appropriate. The child crawling on the floor with animals around fed a reasonable diet is not a problem. And in fact, it's better because it's constantly good challenge. But we have to, everything is nuance. You have to moderate and know what is wise behavior to allow the good microbes and not so many of the bad ones.
But it's interesting you mentioned the germ theory. Now, again, listeners, this is something I want to do a whole show on, and it is controversial in medicine at the moment, this to question germ theory. But it does seem to me that as the medical establishment is seeing it at the moment, there isn't this understanding of this good challenge, this the other side of the battle. It's like immunity is only as strong as what it's fighting. In sport, we say you're only as good as the last match you've played. It's like, actually, we need that real-time fight to actually develop good immunity. Just a quick word on that, Alex. Where do you think germ theory is going wrong? And can we integrate an understanding of the other side of that argument into a medical practice?
Well, it's very interesting because we hear, for example, that when Western industrialized, or maybe not so industrialized at that point, but basically Western men visited peoples who were living closer to the earth, First Nations, indigenous people who were living close to land, that they brought with them diseases that wiped out those people. Now, that may well be true. The point is, I think, as far as we understand it at the moment, and I think it's great that you're going to address this subject, is that clearly there are, for example, Clostridium difficile, C. difficile, or Candida, but particularly C. difficile, is a very powerfully pathogenic bacteria, which you don't really want very much of in your gut, and you certainly don't want any in your cheese if you're making cheese. Because it's once that gets out of condition, dominant, then it is becoming, if you like, the germ theory. It causes disease. But the point is, by having this diversity of population, whether it's in the gut, on the skin, wherever, variety of food, you're building a resilience in a community. And that community then itself keeps those germs, which is not a good word, but, under control. And actually, maybe we always need, quote, again, I don't see it like this, the enemy, in order to maintain balance. It's always that, because it comes back to this idea of competition, or at least load, stress load needs to be present to maintain that healthy response.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned competition. I think it's much. Again, yes, there is some competition in nature, obviously, but in my experience, listening carefully to most, zoologists or biologists who really, really, really studying these things in a wide context, also as well as a narrow one, would be saying that there's much, much more cooperation in nature, as we've been just discussing, in that cooperation, symbiosis between us and our microbes, between microbes themselves. There's lots of reciprocity. So reciprocity, for me, is the name of the game in life, really. Give and take. And so more of that than competition.
So all of this about symbiosis brings us perfectly to your recent book, From Root to Stem, out on Penguin now. And it's this wonderful seasonal guide to natural recipes and remedies that we can literally find growing outside of our house. And that's kind of the key message of your work, right? That it's all around us. It's everywhere, even in the most simple places. The preventative nutrition and the compounds we need to fight those pathologies that and maybe they'd never come out in the first place because we have that strong immunity in the first place. Tell us about the philosophy behind your approach to food, the kind of simple, effective solutions that pepper all of your texts, all your workshops, and all your presentations. A lot of it you've mentioned already.
Well, I think actually it boils down to health is about, as we've talked about, reciprocity, diversity, and being connected, because we are social beings. and microbial beings, and we are already in ecology. And it's about playing out and reflecting that same ecology, connection, connectedness to that diversity in all kinds of spheres of our lives. It's really reflecting the internal diversity and connection with the external. So I would say the words that literally, underpin my whole approach are diversity, reciprocity, connectedness, complexity. Those are really the solutions, if you like, overall, the philosophical basis. And it's mirroring what life is. I'm just doing what life is doing itself. The rest of life is doing itself. We are nature. And so what I realized in writing Root to Stem was how do we respond to the seasons? I mean, if we're not living in the tropics, you and I, where I'm in the northern hemisphere as you are, we have longer days and shorter nights in the summer. That affects so many functions. But we still have this circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm is a daily rhythm which affects all living things, though they respond to it differently. We have different secretions of particular hormones and other compounds timed regularly during the day, which give us an indication of how to eat, when to sleep, largely determined by the circadian rhythm of light and dark. So, first of all, understanding our relationships to the seasons, to the days themselves, how we respond to those is absolutely at the heart of this. And then what plants are around us to sustain us through those. And of course, that varies if you're in the north or in the southern hemisphere in particular. Less so if you're in the equatorial areas of the world. But yes, it's really about the different ways in which we can reconnect to ourselves, to each other, through festivals, through connection of whatever kind. For example, making a meal for somebody. I mean, simple things, even volunteering, This isn't what's making up the whole of the book, but there are little tips in there about how to reconnect to each other, because isolation is actually so bad, if you like, for our mental health. We're just not designed to be in such isolation as many people are with single families and so on. So how can we become more comfortably social, not force somebody to do something they don't want to do, but little ways that we can connect both to nature and both to ourselves through quietness and just learning to understand ourselves a little bit more, both to nature through how we eat, where we walk, what we look at, because nature is say a tree or a reed, both are rooted, and those wonderful metaphors, visual metaphors, help to reinforce, I think, what's inside us and the way we're designed. So design to me is a really crucial thing, and seeing literally how nature outside us is doing it, like the lungs of the planet, so-called, or the trees with all their branches, is reflected in our incredible circulatory system and in our lungs themselves, little branches, rivulets of bronchioles. We call about the bronchial tree. So the rhythms that we have are reflected in nature around us and are very reinforcing of our being, of our habits, of our rhythms. So yes, the book itself is really actually very simple, almost a pocket guide to how we can reconnect to healthy recipes, remedies, whether it's activities or literal recipes for foods and medicine that we can find around us.
And that herbal medicine question is a big one, isn't it? Because I think many of us forget in our modern medical paradigm that most medicines came from from plant-based sources for many, many generations. And we, I think, forget that a lot of that medicine that is found in medicines that we, buy over the counter actually comes from natural food sources that we can not only buy in the supermarket, but we can literally find around the house. Now, just give us a couple of examples from the book of medicines that we might not have known were actual medicines and we can include in our diet really easily.
Right. Well, a really good example, Fred, are these.
What are you showing for our listeners on
So, of course, for the people that are listening, these are black grapes with their seeds. Very significant, because first of all, a plant, if you're a plant, you're sitting in the sun, perhaps, hopefully, for hours, days, months on end. How do you protect yourself, as we would be, shriveled up and burnt from UV light? How incredible that this little grape, this little black grape or a green one, is doing that. So basically what plants do is they produce, as well as their protein, carbs and oils, and then vitamins and minerals, they're producing phytochemicals or phytonutrients as well, which are thousands, literally thousands, of little compounds, little chemicals in very small amounts to protect themselves. So plants have this, we rely on our medicine from plants, firstly. And you're absolutely right. Humans have identified only admittedly some of the compounds of those thousands that a plant produces as its own medicine, as its own antiseptic, antifungal, antimicrobial, communicating chemicals, its defense and its attracting chemicals, which is what it's producing in terms of its colors, its tastes, its smells. All those compounds are the medicine in there, as well as the macro and the micronutrients. So here in these black grapes that I've got here, they've got to protect themselves against UV light. They've got to protect themselves against funguses, viruses, bacteria that are swirling around, varying from day to day, season to season. And in that skin, that black skin, are thousands of compounds, some of which include one called resveratrol. There are polyphenols, there are flavonoids, there are tannins. These are all kinds of phytochemicals which are protecting the plant. And inside this, and this is why I buy the ones with the seeds and get people to crunch the seeds, that of course not very nice tasting, despite the fact that really medicine should be pleasure to some extent, but it can also be very bitter and unpleasant, which is the challenge a bit. The plant has produced and concentrates its phytochemicals that are medicinal to us in the skin, the pith, and the seeds. So we need to be having the choice to buy grapes with their seeds, because in those seeds and in the skin are the chemicals that are our medicine. They're medicine for the plant itself, but in whoever or whatever eats it, it is the medicine and also the nutrients, the medicinal nutrients.
This has become a bit of a challenge for us, hasn't it? This whole thing of the skin and all of these questions about the seeds. Give us a few tips. How can we get back to a very basic bit of knowledge that says just eat the whole thing? Don't take its skin off. How can we get back to that?
Well, I mean, what I had for breakfast this morning, I put in a couple of these. I put in a couple of these black grapes. I had, I think, about 13 or 14 different foods in my, as it happens, a smoothie. But it could have been a porridge. It could have been a muesli with 13 or 14 different things, different foods. That includes things like kefir, maybe yogurt. Those would be two, even if it's a couple of tablespoons of each. Oats, nuts, seeds, 3 lots of seeds. That's going to be 8 items. 3 lots of nuts. That's 10 or 12. 3 lots of berries. Frozen berries, frozen fruit, really good, full of vitamin C, but also loads of phytochemicals in the colors. So when I was showing these black grapes, it's the pigment, color. We need to increase more of these phytochemical, what are called polyphenols, in our diet. So basically eating more color and having 3 different summer fruits, as they call them, and frozen summer fruits. Most of the supermarkets do that as berries, summer berries. You're getting different, you count those as one food item each. So you've got 3 different food items with lots and lots concentrated, full of polyphenols. And those actually go to support the gut microbes, which love to eat they love to eat polyphenols. They eat literally the compounds that are those pigments and make up lots of lovely butyrate, short chain fatty acids, and support our immune cells, among many other things that they're doing. So color, really lots of color. And of course, the beauty is in that skin of the black grape, you're also getting lots of fiber, both soluble and mostly insoluble fiber, which again, the microbes in our guts absolutely love. And it also absorbs water in the gut and enables us to form a lovely, good quality stool and is against constipation.
So this brings me back to the gut, actually, Alex, because I wanted to mention that the research is really pointing towards these dietary fibers and towards fermented foods as being really simple, quick ways that we can repopulate the gut microbiome diversity and population. And I think that they're really quite practical. So talk to us a little bit about both this diet rich in fiber and the fermented foods, and why this works so well for us with our gut.
Well, they have multiple effects. So everything usually in nature, one thing often has multiple effects because it's never just one thing. It comes with a whole mixture of elements. So the fiber, there are 2 kinds of fiber. There's soluble fiber. So you could think of that like porridge has got a gooiness, or leeks have a gooiness to them. And that's the soluble fiber, gel-like things, seaweed, linseed coating, the coating on linseed. Chia seeds, exactly. Amaranth. So that amaranth or linseed has got both soluble fiber, that gooey stuff on the outside when you put it in water, but it's also got lots and lots of insoluble fiber. That's roughage, which we can't process. We don't produce the enzymes to do that. It's only the gut microbes that are able to gobble up that fiber for us. So that's where the symbiosis comes from, and giving us lots of good metabolites, waste products, if you like, in return. So the fibers, those 2 kinds of fiber are absolutely fundamental, but they basically are prebiotic. They're prebiotic. They're food for the gut microbes. But of course, the roughage in something like a kiwi or the skin of vegetables, which we must never get rid of if it's at all edible. We're supposed to be eating that, not cutting it off like the chefs say. I mean, fine for a bit of refined, beautiful, 5-star, 2-star Michelin food, but 3-star Michelin food, but because it's a novelty, it's a joy, it's fine, but not all the time. We need that. We're designed to have been eating that from our hunter-gatherer past. But the fiber itself of the skin, the insoluble fiber, apart from feeding the gut microbes, it also helps to bulk up the stool and keep water in the stool and make it easy to pass. So anyway, many, many other things. And of course, there are pigments in the fiber, the polyphenols and other phytochemicals.
And what about
I should just say
foods? Yeah.
Sorry, and fermented foods. Well, that's giving you a double whammy. You're basically getting lots of probiotic, that is the actual bacteria themselves, which have multiplied when you make a kefir or a yogurt. So you're getting, as it were, completely free microbes. Yes, they've got to pass through a very acidic stomach before they get into the gut. But it seems clinically, the clinical studies show that even though some of them may be killed off in the gut, in the stomach, actually many of them do reach the gut, and so it's still beneficial to eat them. Very beneficial to eat them. Kimchi, another thing. Kimchi, and if you take kimchi, which often has chili in it, whereas sauerkraut is mainly cabbage that's been salted and then fermented, that's great too. But kimchi actually happens to have a circulatory stimulant of capsicum, chili, and usually about 4 or 5 other elements, maybe Chinese cabbage, carrot, onion, garlic. So you've got lots of other elements in there. And what we're really aiming to do is actually go for about 30 foods a day. That doesn't mean 30 fruit and veg, but it means 30 different food items. That can include oils. It could be 2 different oils. That would be 2 foods, rapeseed, say, and extra virgin or walnut oil or whatever. And then all the different spices and herbs, and then the different berries. It's really not difficult to get to 30 a day, which is beginning to go towards the diversity that we're designed for.
Especially if we're using techniques like smoothies.
Soups as well.
Right,
so smoothies,
buzz it all together.
Yeah, little bits of a lot. That's why kimchi, you just have a tablespoon of kimchi and you've already got 7 items. But you don't need a whole plate full of them. You just have a small amount, and then you have a small amount of lots of other things. And black pepper counts, chili, all of these things really count. So yeah, smoothie in the morning, dead easy, but it doesn't have to be a smoothie. You can soak muesli overnight with lots of, frozen berries that you put on the top, a mix of ground seeds, preferably ground, because otherwise you will lose the oil in them. They'll just pass through you, especially linseed. 3 sorts of nuts, 3 or 4 nuts, just a handful of those, a couple of handfuls of seeds. You're not needing a lot. Oatmeal, for example, which is less processed, more for us to do, keep you fuller for longer, keep your blood sugars really under control. Low blood sugar is very stressful because it makes the body go into the sympathetic nervous system stress response to release more blood sugar. So keeping your blood sugar even with those lovely slow release, multiple sorts of foods is basically nourishing so many different functions, of which our body has many and complex at that too. So, and the same thing for lunch, or a main meal. It may be that you don't eat breakfast. That could be fine. In fact, the 5-2 diet or intermittent fasting of various sorts or 14 hours overnight can be really helpful because we overload ourselves with food. And there is no 3-line whip now to have breakfast necessarily. But certainly a main meal during the day, coming back to our circadian rhythm, is what we're designed to be doing, is to eat mostly during the day. And we know that because the circadian rhythm of gastric secretion is lower in the evening. We're designed basically to be active and to eat during the day and to have a much smaller early evening meal and then to fast maybe 14 hours overnight. So, and I don't think, although Tim Spector is advocating grazing at the moment, but grazing, I'd love to know what he thinks about this, because grazing sort of flies in the face of something like the motor migrating complex, the MMC, which is an extra clearing out by the gut, peristalsis, movement by the gut after we've eaten, about an hour or hour and a half, 2 hours after we've eaten, to clear the gut again. Now, if you're grazing all the time, the body is constantly having to produce metabolically demanding pancreatic enzymes, digestive enzymes, acidity, all of that. And it's hard work, and I don't really get that. But in specific cases, and I should have said this before, fiber is not helpful. Maybe grazing is appropriate in certain cases. You never be blanket about everything. Yes, you can have rules of thumbs, but the individual person, their microbiome, their particular condition, what diseases they might have, you're not going to feed somebody with Crohn's a whole lot of fiber because it happens to be good for the microbiome. That would be completely the wrong thing to do. It's just going to irritate an already diseased, unfunctioning, leaky, and goodness knows, ulcerated gut even more and irritate it. So it's about what's appropriate and for how long in each case, really.
And worst case scenario, listeners, if you're looking to understand this better, just trial and error. Just see what works for you. Your body will tell you if it's working or not. And, really, I had such a complex situation with so many determining factors that really I had to just sort of botch it and try different things in different combinations until I got it right, despite having the top advice from geniuses like Alex. Listen, I want to come back to connection because the other theme of this series is, alongside symbiosis, is interconnection. And it's come up several times on the show. We've got an episode on the science of connection, the psychology of connection. We've got a show on parenting by connection, which can completely change the way our society is dealing with all of these fight-flight responses. But I wanted to talk to you about connection with nature, because this is something you talk about a lot. You're a huge advocate of foraging. You really talk about the benefits of being in contact with the soil, being in the garden. In your opinion, what is the importance of foraging and connection with nature to mental and physical health?
Well, I've thought a lot about this, Fred, and I think as I was saying before, really, the connection with nature, I think it's by doing what we're designed for, which is interconnecting with this beauty, for a start, beauty to us, because it probably reinforces life. It's actually connection to life, connection to something growing, hopefully thriving. We see that and we internalize that health and see to some extent ourselves or some of our design in that lovely exterior being. And really, we ought to be not talking about the use of plants, but the interrelationship with plants, and seeing plants, as many other peoples in the world do, who still live closer to nature and understand their reliance, as you were saying, this total reliance on nature, as living beings, as our relations, and to, just as you would, you and I got to know each other a long time ago. As you get to know a friend, you learn their habits, what they like, what they dislike, who they are, where they like to be, what environment do they like to live in. And it's really, is it that different with a plant? Go and look at that daisy. Where does it sit? What does it like? What makes it close up? What makes it die? The nettle, where does that like to put itself? What does it thrive on? What kind of character does that plant have? And it literally changes your whole relationship to the outside world.
That presumably has psychological benefits.
Well, exactly, because you're seeing something that's working outside you. You're seeing something thriving, and that thriving is something you internalize. But also, it's not just about the viewing of it and the being with it. It's also, if you are eating it, and of course, by eating it, and if you do, we don't use our waste, our stool, our rotted down waste matter, unlike the rest of nature, to fertilize. And we should be doing it. It was called night soil, and it was collected, back in the 19th century, and used on allotments. Well, the only trouble is we've got lots of toxins in our stool, no doubt, now because of our industrial life and our unnatural, got to have it fast, quick, speedy, make all these chemicals stuff. But actually, that would be our reciprocity with nature, would be giving back to nature, our waste matter, which we're designed to do. But
is there anything to add on this importance with connection of nature? Because one of our beautiful guests, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, at the end of the last series, he spoke about the research that goes in three directions: this human connection, connection with nature, and connection with a sense of the sacred, which is a word that on a science podcast can cause some problems. But these three things, this sense of a deep meaning, a sense of a sort of higher purpose of the whole of existence, this sense of, as you say, a sort of humility in the face of a codependence with such an extraordinarily beautiful system. And I think that I like this idea of beauty, that you're in the middle, very similar to your experience when you were a teenager, just completely blown away by the extraordinary beauty. And maybe that sense of well-being comes from a sense of belonging, in the same way that we see human connection coming from safety. This sense of feeling very, very positive in a safe space when surrounded by, caring, loving, respecting carers. maybe that's how we feel when we're in nature. We're like, wow, I'm surrounded by a beautiful, caring, respectful nature that wants only for me to thrive. I wonder if that's not part of the reason it makes us feel so good.
I think that's exactly part of it. And also another thing that I think especially relevant now, I mean, there are so many elements that we get from being in nature, so many different messages, you could say. And one of them is also boundaries. You know, you've got a tree that is very clearly, at least to look at it, where it is, or a plant. You know, it is itself. But of course, it's also deeply connected, either through the vast mycobacterial neural network of the planet, you know, the
particularly the fungal element.
network underneath, connecting it to other plants. But it's also very much itself, and it looks sort of independent. It isn't as independent as it looks. But so we get so many metaphors that help us, that reinforce what's actually happening in us, all that reciprocity, but also the boundaries, the self-sufficiency to some extent, but the connection as well, the nourishing, the giving back, you know, the leaves going back to the ground for many plants, or giving sugars to the microbes that are feeding in the rhizomes beneath, through the hairs, the root hairs of the tree or the plant, are giving sugars to the microbes and other insects and so on that are leading particularly to the microbiome in the soil. So I think there's so many, and the sheer look of the plant, which is literally reinforcing the same design patterns that we have in ourselves. So, and then the sacred. I mean, the sacred is, I think, something that we've realized we've developed because of the awe-inspiring nature of the universe. I mean, that's what struck me with my epiphany. You know, this is just so big, so extraordinary, so beautiful, so harmonious in many ways. What do I have to learn from this? So the sacred is what you're talking about, which we can get. I mean, relationships can be sacred, you know, can't they? The way that we should respect the distance, the boundaries, both of ourselves and of others, so that we have that, respect of that other. And I think that's maybe where the origin of sacred comes. It's respect, awe for some as well. But it's all, in a way, goes to reinforcing life. And I think funny, because I never felt we needed to have a creator. You know, I just don't understand, why do we have to have a creator? The more you study this extraordinary business of life, processes of life, the ecology of life, the less, to me, a creator is needed. It's just the meaning of life is to value that sacred, is to be reciprocal. I am life, and my job is to try, being a human, that's really difficult with a prefrontal cortex with lots of its own ego and ideas, but to try to give back, to be in service to this extraordinary thing called life. That's my job. I don't need to find, I mean, that's the biggest meaning any human being, I think, could ever have. And that's what the animals are doing.
It's certainly one of the coolest jobs you could possibly have, isn't it? To promote life.
Yes.
Alex, we've reached the end of our time, and I just want to wrap it up by telling the listeners where they can find your book, where they can find out about Living Medicine, which is your charity. What's the best place for people to come and find out more about all your brilliant research?
Well, I mean, I guess the book, which is a simple pocket guide to how to eat, how to find local, seasonally sourced food, what are the festivals that might go on around the world that reinforce that sense of community, togetherness, ecology, and so on, by the season. That's easily available online or even as an ebook. Living Medicine is a charity basically to teach the very basic stuff about how we are designed to boost our immune systems, to improve, to manage or prevent chronic disease. And it's designed for workshops, practical hands-on workshops that we run in places like Chelsea Physic Garden, to patients as well through social prescribing. And that's on livingmedicine.org, very easy. There are some handouts, two or three handouts. And we also did one for parents and children, how, the basics of how do you boost resilience and immunity and live healthily.
And what about people looking to get clinical medical herbalist viewing with you? I understand you have a clinic. Where's the best place if people are London-based or near London, if they want to actually book an appointment and get some treatment?
Well, I work in a hospital. It's the only hospital, as far as we know about, hospital dermatology clinic where there's a medical herbalist, phytotherapist. It's a teaching clinic, and that's in Whipps Cross Hospital, but that has to be through a GP or other referral. Yes, I do private practice, but only in Fulham, but only really through word of mouth. I don't advertise it. And basically, to find a medical herbalist, I might actually send you some really helpful links, because there is a wonderful organization which is really bringing all herbalists together, the Herbal Alliance. There are qualified professional associations that are for professional herbalists who've done their 500 clinical hours and 3 to 4 years of training in a lot of medicine and biochemistry and herbal therapeutics. And again, I can forward those so you can pop those up. And that's the way to find a qualified herbalist.
We're definitely going to be cashing in on your knowledge to get as many interesting links and useful reading and background knowledge to support everything we've been talking about in this episode, if you want to get deeper, listeners. So it remains just for me to thank you so much, Alex, for sharing this vast body of knowledge so accessibly, so easily. I really do agree that this is not complicated stuff. It feels like we're fighting a battle, but really, actually, all we're doing is fighting back against the marketing of a much larger, commercially thought through food solution that just isn't taking enough of this into consideration. So thank you, Alex, for making it all seem so doable. We can do this.
Thank you, Fred. It's really fun to talk.